All right, ready to dive deep into sustainable agriculture and hazelnuts? I mean, you sent this Treasury white paper over, and I gotta admit, like, blockchain hazelnut orchards, it wasn't what I expected at first. But the more I dig in, I think we've got something pretty interesting here. This company in Serbia, they want to plant a huge hazelnut orchard, and they're using blockchain to fund the whole thing. But here's a real kicker. They're not just selling hazelnuts, they're generating carbon credits too. Talk about a delicious way to invest in a greener future. So what was your first impression when you saw this?
Honestly, I was drawn to the team's credentials right away. Like, you got these seasoned hazelnut growers, planted thousands of hectares. You've got a scientist from the Biosense Institute bringing AI to agriculture, and then a chief growth officer all the way from Australia. This is not just some hobbyist group. This is a powerhouse team they put together.
That's a great point, yeah. I mean, it's one thing to have an idea, but it's another thing to have the expertise to really execute it. But I gotta ask, why Serbia? Why hazelnuts? What makes this combination so special?
They lay out a strong case in this white paper. Serbia's got the perfect climate, perfect soil for hazelnut trees. Plus, it's got a really strategic location, perfect for accessing that European market. And compared to other crops, like your blueberries and apples, hazelnuts need way less labor, which means lower costs and less environmental impact.
So less work, more nuts, smaller carbon footprint. Sounds like a win-win-win to me. But they also talk about some pretty cutting-edge technology: drones, sensors, satellite imagery, AI, the whole shebang. What stood out to you in this section?
This is where it gets really cool. They're talking about agriculture 4.0, using all this tech to create a really efficient system. So think, drones monitoring the health of each tree. Sensors are collecting data about soil conditions. And then AI is analyzing everything, optimizing irrigation, predicting yields. It's all happening.
So instead of just, like kind of guessing and hoping for the best, they're using data to really make smarter decisions. Less waste, bigger harvest. It all makes sense. And it sounds like they're not just using tech for efficiency, but they're also leveraging it for transparency, right? They talk about tracking those hazelnuts from farm to consumer using blockchain.
Exactly. That level of transparency, it's pretty rare these days. So knowing the exact origin and journey of your food, that builds trust with consumers, especially the ones concerned about sustainability and ethical sourcing.
It's funny, I always thought of hazelnuts as just, something tasty to toss in my trail mix, but this deep dive is really making me see them in a whole new light. Speaking of seeing things in a new light, they highlight the fact that demand for hazelnuts has been outpacing supply for years. And you know what that means.
Higher prices, right? Could mean a solid return for anyone who's backing this project. They even break down how much Ferrero, the Nutella giant, consumes. It's like 25% of the global supply. It's huge. It's a huge market for these little nuts.
Okay, so we've got the dream team, strategic location, sustainable practices, a hot commodity, and a high-tech approach. But how does all of this connect to the tokenization part? This is where it gets a little more complex, right?
Right. And this is where Treasury's approach gets really innovative. So instead of traditional investments, they're using blockchain tech to create what they call the Treasury token. Think of it as a digital representation of, like, a hazelnut sapling.
So when you buy a Treasury token, you're essentially investing in a piece of this orchard. But what are you actually getting back from that investment?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. It's not just returns from the hazelnuts that your tree produces. They're also factoring in the carbon credits generated by that tree over its lifetime. So that adds another layer of value to the whole investment.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying there's a double return? One from the hazelnuts themselves, and another from the environmental benefit of the tree. This carbon credit thing, we need to unpack that a bit more.
Yeah, let's break down exactly how those work and why they're such a valuable addition to the whole Treasury model. Okay, so carbon credits, right? They're basically permits representing a reduction of greenhouse gases. So companies that go over their emissions limits, they can buy these credits to offset their impact. And companies like Treasuries, who are actively pulling carbon out of the air, they can sell those credits. It's a market-based approach to incentivize everyone to reduce their footprint, And in this case, the carbon credits from the orchard are tied to the tokens, which just adds a whole other dimension to the investment.
So it's like you're getting a return on your investment from two directions. Delicious hazelnuts and planet-saving carbon credits, pretty cool. But isn't that carbon credit market notoriously volatile? How can they guarantee a stable return from that side of things?
That's a great question. And they actually address it head on in the white paper. They've partnered with a reputable carbon credit verification agency, so that makes sure their credits are meeting the highest standards. Plus, they're projecting a pretty conservative price for the credits in their financial models, just to account for any potential market fluctuations.
Okay, so they're being smart about managing that risk. But let's talk about another potential risk. What happens to my investment if, say, a tree dies?
Well, they've got insurance for those kinds of situations, but your investment isn't actually tied to just one tree. It's spread across the entire orchard. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Right, it's like a diversified portfolio of hazelnut trees. But even with all these precautions, this is still agriculture, right? There's always going to be things outside of anyone's control, weather, pests, you name it. How do they address those kinds of risks in the white paper?
They don't shy away from it, which is good. They talk about using drought-resistant hazelnut varieties, integrated pest management systems. They even have backup water sources in case of a dry spell.
So they're really trying to think ahead and be as prepared as possible. But what about the financial side of things? You mentioned they projected returns between 12% and 15% annually. How do they come up with those numbers?
Well, their projections are based on a really detailed breakdown of their costs and expected revenue. So they're factoring in things like, land acquisition, planting costs, operating expenses, labor, and of course the hazelnut and carbon credit market prices.
And you've looked at these numbers. Do they seem realistic to you?
Yeah, I mean, they've taken a conservative approach, which I like. They're not overpromising anything. They even ran multiple scenarios, factoring in different yield levels and market prices, just to demonstrate how the investment could perform under different conditions.
So they're not just throwing out some random figures. There's actual data and analysis backing it all up. But even with solid projections, some people might be, skeptical about this whole tokenization thing. Some folks see it as just like a trendy buzzword, a way to slap a tech label on something and make it sound more appealing. How would you address that skepticism?
I get that, for sure. Blockchain can seem kind of abstract, but in this case, tokenization has a very real purpose. It's about democratizing access to agricultural investments. Like, traditionally, you needed serious capital to invest in something like a hazelnut orchard.
Yeah, you couldn't just buy like a few shares of Hazelnut Farms Inc.
Yeah,
on the stock market, right?
exactly. But with these treasury tokens, anyone can become a hazelnut investor with a relatively small amount of money. And because it's built on blockchain, you get that added benefit of transparency, security, and potentially even liquidity, since they plan to list the token on exchanges.
So it's not just about making the investment more accessible. It's also about making it more transparent and potentially more liquid. It's giving everyday investors a chance to be part of something that's traditionally been out of reach. And let's not forget another major piece of this, the sustainability aspect. They dedicate a whole section of the white paper to the environmental benefits of hazelnut orchards. What are some of the key takeaways there?
Well, first and foremost, hazelnut trees are amazing carbon sinks. They absorb and store tons of CO2, which helps fight climate change. And Treasury is going beyond just the trees themselves. They're implementing sustainable practices across their whole operation. Water conservation, soil health, renewable energy. It's a holistic approach.
It's like they're trying to create a closed-loop system, minimizing their impact while maximizing their output.
Exactly. And they're being intentional about their location, too. By planting in Serbia, they're not contributing to deforestation in other regions. Plus, they're working with local communities to create a sustainable ecosystem that benefits everyone.
I love that they're not just thinking about their own profits, they're actually considering the social and environmental impact of this whole project. It's a much more holistic approach to agriculture. But they also mentioned some potential risks to the project that are a bit less obvious, right?
They do, yeah. And I think it's great they're transparent about it.
Yeah.
For example, they address the risk of land expropriation, which can be a real concern in some regions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even with the best intentions and sustainable practices, there are always those external factors that can come into play. So how do they plan to mitigate that kind of risk?
Well, they've chosen a region with a pretty stable political climate, and there's a strong legal framework in place that protects property rights. Plus, they've been thorough in securing all the necessary permits and approvals for the project.
It sounds like they're doing their homework and taking all the right steps to minimize those risks. But let's not forget another potential risk in the digital age, cybersecurity.
Right, exactly. They even mentioned the possibility of hacker attacks, which might seem a little out there when we're talking about hazelnuts. But it just highlights how even a traditional industry like agriculture is so intertwined with tech now.
And anytime you're dealing with tech, especially blockchain, you have to be aware of those cybersecurity risks.
Absolutely. They outline their cybersecurity measures in the white paper, things like multi-signature wallets for storing funds, regular security audits, And they even have an incident response plan in case of a breach.
It's good to know they're taking these threats seriously and putting the necessary safeguards in place. But I'm curious, what about the long-term outlook for this project? What happens after that initial investment phase? How does Treasury plan to manage the orchard and generate those ongoing returns for investors?
That's where their long-term vision really comes in. They've got a detailed roadmap outlined for the next 40 years, which is the typical lifespan of a hazelnut orchard.
A 40-year plan, huh? That's impressive. Shows real commitment to this project. So what does that roadmap look like?
Pretty comprehensive. The first few years, they're focused on planting and getting the orchard established. Then, as those trees mature, they'll start generating revenue from hazelnut sales. And once that carbon sequestration program's up and running, that'll be another revenue stream coming in.
So those initial years are about getting everything set up, and then those returns start rolling in as the orchard matures. But what about investors? How do they actually see a return on their investment during that 40-year period?
Well, they've got a couple options outlined. Investors can just hold on to their tokens and receive annual payouts from the hazelnut sales and the carbon credit revenue. Or, once that token's listed on exchanges, they can sell their tokens on the secondary market if they want.
So there's some flexibility there for investors to choose their own exit strategy. They can play the long game, collect those annual payouts, or they can go for a quicker return by selling their tokens. Kind of like choosing between getting a steady dividend or playing the stock market. But what if Treasury decides to sell the whole orchard down the line? What happens then?
They've addressed that as well. If the orchard is sold, all the proceeds get distributed to the token holders. So no matter what, investors are covered.
It's great that they're thinking about all these different scenarios and giving investors a clear picture of what to expect. But stepping back for a moment, what are your overall thoughts on this project? Do you think it has the potential to be, truly transformative?
I do. I think Treasury is a great example of how blockchain can be used for good. It's not just about making money. It's about creating a more sustainable and equitable food system, combining cutting-edge technology with those traditional agricultural practices to create something really innovative.
Yeah, I agree. They're not just talking about sustainability, they're putting it into action. And they're not just promising profits, they're actually providing a transparent and detailed plan to show how they're going to achieve those. And it's not just about the tech and finances, it's about the people too. They're working with those local communities, creating jobs, sharing knowledge. They're not just planting trees, they're planting the seeds for something bigger. I came into this deep dive expecting to learn about hazelnuts, which I did, but I learned so much more than that. I learned about the power of blockchain to democratize investing, the growing importance of carbon credits, the potential for agriculture to be profitable and sustainable, and just the incredible things that can happen when people with a shared vision come together. It really makes you wonder, what other industries could be transformed by this kind of thinking? What other unexpected combinations are out there? It's an exciting time, and who knows, maybe someday we'll all be saying, remember when hazelnuts changed the world? So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep your eyes open. You never know where the next deep dive will take you. And until then, we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.